In the summer of 1972, a helicopter carrying two officials from the British Columbia Forest Service descended through low cloud cover toward a research station that had stopped responding to radio contact. The station, designated Camp 17 North, was located in a remote valley approximately 140 kilometers northeast of Prince George, accessible only by air or deteriorating logging road that took 8 hours to traverse in favorable conditions. The pilot, Gerald Moss, had flown this route 11 times before. He knew the clearing. He knew the arrangement of the 4 prefabricated structures that comprised the camp. What he did not expect was a complete absence of movement. Camp 17 North had been operational since May of that year. Its purpose was straightforward: to monitor the spread of spruce bark beetle infestations across a 200-square-kilometer tract of Crown land. 6 researchers had been stationed there under a rotating schedule. 2 were supposed to remain on-site at all times. Radio contact was mandatory every 72 hours. The last transmission had been received on July 9th. It was brief. The voice belonged to Thomas Hendry, a 34-year-old entomologist with the provincial government. He reported normal conditions, no equipment failure, no medical concerns. He confirmed that his partner, a field technician named Alan Decker, was present and that they had sufficient supplies until the scheduled resupply flight on July 18th. That transmission lasted 41 seconds. When the scheduled check-in on July 12 produced no response, protocol required a second attempt 6 hours later. That also failed. A third attempt on the morning of July 13th yielded only static. By the afternoon, the decision was made to send the helicopter. Moss set the aircraft down in the center of the clearing at 2:47 p.m. on July 14th. The 2 Forest Service officials, David Ulrich and Martin Cray, exited immediately. Both men carried clipboards. Neither carried weapons. There was no reason to believe they would need them. The camp appeared undisturbed from the air. The structures were intact. The equipment shed was closed. A tarp covered a stack of fuel drums near the eastern perimeter. But as Ulrich and Cray approached the main cabin, they noticed the door was slightly ajar. Ulrich called out. No response. He pushed the door open. The interior was orderly. 2 cots were made, blankets folded with precision. A kettle sat on the propane stove. Dishes were stacked and dry. A logbook lay open on the table, a pen resting in the crease between pages. The last entry was dated July 10th, written in Hendry's handwriting. It documented beetle counts from 3 sample sites. Nothing unusual, but Hendry and Decker were not there. Cray moved to the second cabin, which housed the communication equipment and additional storage. The radio was off. The generator outside was silent, though it contained fuel. A calendar on the wall had July 9th circled in red ink. Beside it, someone had written, "Resupply confirmed." The third structure was a field laboratory, a small, insulated building containing microscopes, specimen jars, and a kerosene heater. The door was locked from the outside. Ulrich used a key from the main cabin to open it. Inside, everything was in place. Samples were labeled and stored. No sign of disruption. The fourth building was the equipment shed. It contained tools, spare parts, and emergency supplies. The door was also locked. When they opened it, they found all items accounted for, including 2 backpacks, 2 sleeping bags, and 2 emergency flares. Moss joined them after securing the helicopter. The 3 men stood in the clearing and assessed what they knew. 2 men were missing. Their personal belongings remained. The camp showed no evidence of struggle, theft, or hasty departure. The radio had been turned off deliberately. The generator had been shut down. Ulrich suggested they search the perimeter. The forest around Camp 17 North was dense, old-growth spruce and lodgepole pine, with thick underbrush that made navigation difficult without marked trails. The researchers had established several paths leading to their monitoring sites, each flagged with reflective tape. They began with the nearest trail, which led northwest toward a section of forest where beetle activity had been heaviest. The trail was clear. The flags were intact. After 20 minutes, they reached the first monitoring site, a cluster of spruce trees with numbered tags nailed into the bark. A metal clipboard hung from a branch, its pages damp but legible. The most recent entry was dated July 9th, Hendry's handwriting again. They returned to camp and tried the second trail, heading east. This one ended at a creek approximately half a kilometer from the clearing. A water filtration kit was set up on the bank, along with 2 empty jerry cans. No footprints in the soft soil. No disturbance. The third trail led south, toward higher elevation. It was longer, nearly 2 kilometers, and took them to a ridge overlooking the valley. At the top, they found a small weather station, an anemometer, a rain gauge, and a thermometer mounted on a wooden post. A notebook in a waterproof case documented daily readings. The last entry was July 10th. By the time they returned to camp, it was after 6 p.m. The light was failing. Moss recommended they stay the night and continue searching in the morning. Ulrich agreed. They slept in the main cabin, taking turns on watch. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of an owl. No unusual sounds. No movement. At first light, they expanded the search. Moss flew a low-grid pattern over the surrounding area while Ulrich and Cray walked additional trails. They found nothing. No clothing. No tracks. No signs of injury or distress. At 11:30 a.m. on July 15th, Moss radioed for additional personnel. By July 17th, 8 people were on site, including 2 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They conducted a systematic search of a 5-kilometer radius. They examined every structure, every trail, every piece of equipment. They reviewed the logbook, the radio logs, and the weather data. What they learned raised questions they could not answer. The logbook told a story of routine. Hendry and Decker had arrived at Camp 17 North on July 3rd, replacing 2 researchers who had completed their rotation. The handover had been unremarkable. Supplies were adequate. Equipment functioned properly. The outgoing team reported no issues. For the first week, Hendry and Decker followed the established protocol. They monitored beetle populations at designated sites. They recorded weather data. They maintained the camp. Their entries were precise, methodical, and consistent with previous documentation. But on July 9th, something changed. The entry for that day was shorter than usual. Hendry noted beetle counts from only 2 sites instead of the standard 3. He made no mention of Decker's activities, which was a departure from the usual practice of documenting both researchers' work. The handwriting was slightly hurried, not illegible, but less controlled than in prior entries. The final line read, "Radio contact at 1400. All clear." That transmission had been logged by the Forest Service. It matched the time recorded in the logbook, but there was no entry for July 10th. Except there was. In the field laboratory, investigators found a separate notebook used for specimen documentation. It was small, spiral-bound, and not part of the official record-keeping system. Inside, someone had written a single entry on July 10th. The handwriting did not match Hendry's. It was shakier, less confident. The entry read, "Counted again. 14 trees. Same result. T says stop." There was no signature, no further explanation. The investigators cross-referenced this with the monitoring data. Site 7, located on the Northwest Trail, had been visited on July 9th. Hendry's official log recorded normal beetle activity, moderate infestation across 12 tag trees. But the unofficial notebook suggested a second count had been conducted on July 10th, yielding a different number of trees, 14 instead of 12. This discrepancy was small but significant. The monitoring sites were carefully mapped. The number of tag trees at each location was fixed. Site 7 had 12 trees, not 14. The RCMP officers, Constable Raymond Pike and Corporal Judith Voss, returned to Site 7 on July 18th with a surveyor's map. They counted the trees. 12. All tags were accounted for. The numbers matched the original site documentation from May. There was no evidence that additional trees had been tagged or that any tags had been removed. Pike photographed each tree. Voss sketched the layout. They measured distances between trunks and compared them to the map. Everything aligned. But someone had counted 14. Back at camp, they examined the weather station data. Hendry had been diligent about recording daily readings: temperature, wind speed, precipitation. The log showed consistent entries through July 9th. On July 10th, the readings were recorded, but the handwriting was different, smaller, compressed. It matched the handwriting in the unofficial notebook. This meant Decker, if it was Decker, had taken over certain tasks on July 10th. Why? Hendry had always handled the weather data. It was part of his routine, documented across multiple rotations at different camps. For him to delegate this task suggested either incapacity or change in priorities. Voss interviewed the two researchers who had been at Camp 17 North prior to Hendry and Decker. Neither reported anything unusual about the site. No strange occurrences. No equipment malfunctions. No interpersonal conflicts. They described the location as isolated but unremarkable, a functional research station in an unremarkable stretch of forest. One of them, a botanist named Elena Marsh, mentioned that Decker had seemed distracted during the handover. When pressed, she clarified that he had asked several questions about the surrounding terrain, specifically whether anyone had explored beyond the established trails. Marsh had told him no. The trails were sufficient for the research objectives. Venturing into unmarked forest was discouraged due to the density of the underbrush and the risk of disorientation. Decker had nodded. He did not pursue the subject further. Pike requested Decker's personnel file. Alan Decker was 29 years old, employed as a field technician for 3 years. His record was clean. No disciplinary issues. No medical concerns. He had worked at 4 other research camps without incident. Supervisors described him as reliable, quiet, and competent. Hendry's file was similarly unremarkable. He had been with the Forest Service for 6 years. He held a master's degree in entomology. He had published 2 papers on bark beetle behavior. His performance reviews were consistently positive. He was described as methodical, detail-oriented, and calm under pressure. Neither man had a history of erratic behavior. Neither had expressed dissatisfaction with the assignment. Neither had personal circumstances, financial trouble, family crisis, legal issues that would suggest a motive for disappearance. On July 20th, the search was expanded to a 10-kilometer radius. A tracking dog was brought in. The animal was given Hendry's shirt to scent. It circled the camp twice, then moved toward the Northwest Trail, the path leading to Site 7. At the monitoring location, the dog became agitated. It barked, paced, and repeatedly returned to a spot approximately 3 meters from the nearest tag tree. There was nothing there. No disturbed soil. No blood. No fabric. No evidence of human presence. The handler allowed the dog to continue. It moved off the trail, pushing into the underbrush. For 10 minutes, it maintained a steady direction, west, then slightly north. Then it stopped. It sat down and refused to proceed further. Pike and Voss followed the dog's path. They found no tracks, no broken branches, no indication that anyone had moved through this section of forest recently. But the dog had stopped at a tree. It was a spruce, older than most in the surrounding area, its trunk thick and scarred with age. Near the base, someone had carved a symbol into the bark. It was not recent. The wood had healed over, leaving a faint, raised outline. The symbol was simple, a vertical line bisected by 2 horizontal marks, forming a shape resembling a capital I with crossbars. Pike photographed it. Voss sketched it. Neither recognized it. They searched the area for additional markings. There were none. The dog refused to move beyond this point. After 15 minutes, the handler led it back to camp. That night, Voss reviewed the camp supply inventory. Food, fuel, medical supplies, all were consistent with the expected consumption rate for 2 people over 12 days. Nothing was missing. Nothing was excessive. But in the main cabin, she found something that had been overlooked during the initial search. Beneath one of the cots, pushed against the wall, was a small cardboard box. Inside were personal items, a wristwatch, a pocket knife, a wallet, and a folded piece of paper. The wallet belonged to Henry. It contained his driver's license, $23, and a photograph of a woman and a young child. The piece of paper was a hand-drawn map. The map was crude, sketched in pencil on a sheet torn from the field notebook. It depicted the camp as a small square in the center, with the 3 established trails radiating outward. But there was a 4th line, unlabeled, extending west from the camp, curving slightly north. At the end of this line was a small X. There was no date, no signature, no accompanying text. Voss compared the map to the official survey charts. The 4th line did not correspond to any known trail or landmark. If accurate, it would place the X approximately 4 kilometers from camp in an area that had not been searched. Pike organized a team to investigate. On the morning of July 21st, 5 people, Pike, Voss, Moss, and 2 Forest Service personnel, set out on the bearing indicated by the map. The terrain was difficult. The underbrush was dense, and the ground rose steadily toward a low ridge. There were no trails. Progress was slow. After 2 hours, they reached a narrow ravine. A seasonal creek ran through it, nearly dry in the summer heat. The sides of the ravine were steep but navigable. They descended carefully. At the bottom, they found the first sign of human presence, a piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dark blue, consistent with the standard-issue work shirts worn by Forest Service personnel. The fabric was torn, not cut. Voss bagged it. They continued along the ravine. The creek bed was rocky, scattered with deadfall and moss-covered stones. After another 30 minutes, the ravine widened into a small clearing, barely 10 meters across, surrounded by spruce and fir. In the center of the clearing was a cairn. It was constructed from stones gathered from the creek bed, stacked to roughly waist height. The structure was deliberate, stable, not the result of natural erosion or animal activity. Pike approached it carefully. He photographed it from multiple angles, then began to dismantle it. Beneath the stones, they found a backpack. It was olive green, military surplus, worn but intact. Inside were the following items: a flashlight with dead batteries, a coil of nylon rope, a canteen half filled with water, a compass, and a notebook. The notebook was water damaged but partially legible. It belonged to Decker. His name was written inside the front cover. The entries were sparse and undated, but the handwriting matched the unofficial notes found in the field laboratory. The first few pages contained routine observations, tree counts, weather conditions, equipment maintenance. But midway through, the tone changed. One entry read, "T won't listen. I showed him the map. He says it's not possible. But I counted. I know what I saw." Several pages later, went back alone. Same trees, different placement. T thinks I'm losing it. Maybe I am. And near the end, in handwriting that was barely controlled, "If you find this, we tried to leave. The trees don't match the map anymore. We're going west." The final page was blank except for a single word, written large and underlined twice. "Run." Pike sealed the notebook in an evidence bag. The team searched the clearing and the surrounding area for another hour. They found no bodies, no additional belongings, no evidence of injury or struggle. But near the edge of the clearing, Voss found something that made her stop. A tree, another spruce, bore the same carved symbol they had found earlier, a vertical line with 2 horizontal crossbars. The carving was old, healed over, identical in size and style to the first. Pike measured the distance between the clearing and the location where the dog had stopped. According to his GPS, they were 1.3 kilometers apart. That night, back at camp, Voss compiled the evidence. The timeline was incomplete, but a sequence emerged. Hendry and Decker had arrived on July 3rd and worked normally through July 8th. On July 9th, something prompted Decker to recount the trees at Site 7. He documented 14 trees instead of 12. Hendry dismissed this discrepancy. On July 10th, Decker took over some of Hendry's tasks and made additional notes suggesting the forest did not match the official maps. By July 11th or 12th, The exact date was unclear. Both men decided to leave camp, traveling west into unmapped terrain. At some point, they abandoned the backpack beneath the can. After that, there was no trace. Pike requested aerial reconnaissance. On July 23rd, a spotter plane flew a grid pattern over the area west of clearing. The pilot reported no signs of human activity. No clearings. No structures. No smoke. The forest was unbroken. On July 25th, the RCMP suspended active search operations. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, but with no leads and no evidence of foul play, resources were redirected. The camp was officially closed on July 28th. All equipment and documentation were removed. The structures were left standing but marked as inactive. In August, Hendry's wife, Margaret, traveled to Prince George to meet with investigators. She was shown the notebook, the map, and the personal items recovered from the camp. She confirmed the handwriting as her husband's. She stated that he had no history of mental illness, no interest in disappearing, and no reason to believe he was in danger. She described him as rational, cautious, and committed to his work. When shown the carved symbol, she paused. She said it looked familiar but could not place it. She asked to see the photograph again. After a long silence, she said her husband had once mentioned the surveyor's mark used in old logging operations, something crews carved into trees to indicate boundaries or hazards. She did not know if this was related. Pike contacted the provincial archives. A records clerk found references to several logging companies that had operated in the region between 1910 and 1945. Some had used proprietary marking systems, but documentation was incomplete. No surviving records matched the symbol. Decca's mother, interviewed by telephone, had no explanation. She said her son had always been curious, prone to asking questions, but never reckless. She asked if he might have gotten lost. Pike explained that both men were experienced in wilderness navigation and that the camp had been equipped with maps, compasses, and a radio. She asked why they would leave. Pike did not have an answer. In September 1972, a forestry crew working 12 kilometers west of Camp 17 North discovered a second can. It was similar in construction to the first, stacked stones, deliberate placement, but larger. Beneath it, they found no backpack, no belongings, only a single item, a compass. The compass was functional. Its casing was scratched but intact. There was no identifying information. The crew reported the find to the RCMP. Pike and Voss returned to the area on September 14th. They searched a 1-kilometer radius around the second can. They found nothing else. The compass was sent to the Forest Service Equipment Office in Prince George. A clerk confirmed it matched the standard-issue model provided to research teams. However, serial numbers were not tracked, and there was no way to definitively link it to Hendry or Decca. Pike noted the location of the second can and compared it to the hand-drawn map found in Hendry's belongings. Extrapolating the line in the X, the second can was roughly consistent with the projected path, assuming the men had continued west after abandoning the backpack. But if they had continued, why build another can? And why leave only the compass? Voss proposed a theory. The cans were markers. The men were attempting to leave a trail, either for rescuers or for themselves in case they needed to double back. But this did not explain why they had left the camp in the first place, or why they had not used the radio to call for help before departing. Pike requested a review of the camp's radio logs. The equipment had been tested after the disappearance and found to be fully operational. There was no evidence of tampering or malfunction. The generator had fuel. The batteries were charged. If Hendry and Decca had wanted to call for help, they could have, but they had turned the radio off. In October, a hiker unaffiliated with the search found a third can, this one nearly 18 kilometers from Camp 17 North, in a direction consistent with the trajectory established by the first two. Beneath it was a single item, a wristwatch. The watch was analog with a leather band. It had stopped at 11:43. The date function showed the 12th, presumably July 12th, though the watch did not display the month or year. The watch was not government-issued. Pike cross-referenced it with the inventory of personal items. Hendry had left his watch at camp. It had been found in the box beneath the cot. Decker's possessions had never been fully catalogued, but his mother confirmed he typically wore a watch matching this description. If the watch was Decker's, and if it had stopped on July 12th, it suggested the men had been alive and moving at least 3 days after the last radio contact. But 18 kilometers in 3 days was slow. The terrain was difficult, but both men were physically capable. If they had been traveling steadily, they should have covered more ground. Unless they had not been traveling steadily. Unless they had been stopping, searching, doubling back. Pike returned to the field laboratory notes. The phrase "counted again" suggested multiple visits to the same location. The phrase "same result" implied Decker had expected a different outcome. And the phrase "T says stop" indicated Hendry had attempted to halt whatever Decker was doing. Voss reviewed the map again. The 3 cairns formed a line extending west-northwest from Camp 17 north. If extrapolated further, the line would eventually reach a section of forest that had been logged in the 1930s and left to regenerate. Modern maps showed it as undeveloped crown land. Historical records indicated it had been surveyed in 1931 by a crew working for a company called Heatherdale Timber. Heatherdale Timber had gone bankrupt in 1947. Most of its records had been lost or destroyed. But the provincial archives held a single document, a surveyor's report from 1931, describing the boundaries of a timber lease. The report mentioned boundary markers carved into standing timber to delineate the lease area. The markers were described as a vertical line with 2 lateral bars. Pike obtained a copy of the report. The description matched the symbol found carved into the trees near Camp 17 North and the clearing. But the lease area, according to the 1931 map, was over 40 kilometers from Camp 17 North. The carved trees Pike and Voss had found were nowhere near the historical lease boundary. Voss contacted a forestry historian at the University of British Columbia. The historian explained that old-growth forests could live for centuries and that a tree carved in 1931 could still be standing in 1972. However, he noted that surveyors typically mark boundaries at regular intervals, every few hundred meters, to ensure visibility and accuracy. If the 2 marked trees found near Camp 17 North were part of the 1931 survey, there should be others, dozens of them, forming a line or perimeter. Pike and Voss returned to the forest in late October. They hiked the area between the camp and the first cairn, searching for additional carvings. Over 3 days, they found 6 more trees bearing the symbol. The carvings were old, healed, and consistent in style, but they did not form a line. They did not correspond to any boundary shown on the 1931 map. Their placement was irregular, almost random. Voss plotted them on a topographical map. The marked trees, the cairns, and the camp formed a rough arc, curving west and north. The arc did not correspond to any natural feature, no ridge, no river, no geological formation. The historian reviewed the plot. He had no explanation. He suggested the marks might not be survey boundaries at all. Perhaps they were trail markers, logging hazards, or some other notation. But if they were trail markers, where did the trail lead? Pike submitted a formal request to expand the search, but it was denied. The case remained open, but without new evidence or a credible lead, no additional resources would be allocated. Hendry and Decker were presumed lost in the wilderness, likely deceased due to exposure, injury, or misadventure. In December 1972, the file was transferred to Provincial Cold Case Division. Margaret Hendry moved to Ontario in 1973. She did not return to British Columbia. Decker's mother passed away in 1981. Camp 17 North was dismantled in 1975. The structures were removed. The clearing was left to regenerate. In 1984, a logging crew working in the area reported finding a 4th cairn, this one over 30 kilometers from the original camp. No items were found beneath it, just stones. The crew foreman mentioned it to a supervisor, who mentioned it to a regional manager, who filed a brief report. No investigation was conducted. In 1998, a graduate student researching historical forestry practices came across the 1972 case file while reviewing archived RCMP records. Intrigued, he contacted Corporal Judith Voss, who had since retired. She agreed to an interview. Voss told him she had returned to the area twice on her own time, once in 1979 and again in 1985. Both times, she had searched for additional cans or mock trees. She found nothing new, but she said the forest felt different each time. Not threatening, just inconsistent. She described it as though the landmarks did not stay where they were supposed to be. The graduate student asked if she believed Hendry and Decker had gotten lost. Voss paused. Then she said she believed they had been trying to find something, and that whatever they found, or whatever found them, was not something she could explain. She still had the notebook Decker had left beneath the can. She had kept it after the case was closed, a violation of protocol, but no one had asked for it back. She showed the graduate student the final page. The word run, underlined twice. She said she had never understood it, not as a warning, not as advice, but as a realization, that by the time you knew enough to run, it was already too late.